There are monuments to people and historical events all across Maine. Some are stone with names and dates, some are bronze plaques. But one monument is an airplane. If you've entered what used to be the Brunswick Naval Air Station over the years, you've surely seen it. But seeing it and learning the story behind it are two different things. 207's Don Kerrigan got to do both and is here to enlighten us.
I did, Rob. Thanks very much. Plenty of stuff to fill up the reporter's notebook on that one. You know, that plane has been sitting there for 55 years and in the weather and was starting to look pretty shabby. So a bunch of vets and the folks at the Brunswick Naval Air Station Museum got together to change all that. And a couple of weeks ago, a whole lot of old veterans got together to cheer and share the stories. When the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was very real, Maine was on the front lines. Nuclear bombers sat ready to go at Loring Air Force Base and Dow Air Force Base. And at sea, where Soviet submarines were a threat,
the Russians had hundreds of subs, and a dozen of them were off our coast at all times, nuclear armed and nuclear powered. We'd fly someplace. That
job fell to guys like Bill Locke and Red Adams, flying anti-sub missions from Brunswick Naval Air Station.
Surveillance type missions, but we did, submarines, looking for a submarine, you had to drop sonobuoys and listen underwater, which this airplane is equipped to do.
Their aircraft was the P-2 Neptune. From the early 1950s until the late 60s, these planes and their crews fought the Cold War over the North Atlantic. That included this plane that began service at Brunswick in 1953 with the old Patrol Squadron VP-10. The plane has been on permanent display here for the past 55 years, and now, thanks to Navy vets and local business donations, restored to look her best.
She depicts the tales of countless men who flew and maintained P-2s while stationed at NAS Brunswick.
And those P-2 veterans, now in their 80s and 90s, came back to cheer.
They have no clue what we did. I was, 18, 19 years old when we were doing this. I'm now 80, and I flew on one of the LH-11.
Ken Vomey from New Hampshire says these planes took him over much of the world.
Worked from Iceland into the Mediterranean. I also worked on the Cuban Missile Crisis in Key West, Florida.
That got exciting.
That was kind of exciting because we worked with the submarines down there.
I almost got shot down.
That was in Eastern Europe when Joe Grace was piloting P-2s out of Brunswick. He started when the planes were nearly new.
They were very nice to fly, but they had started out as P-2B2s. They weighed 50,000 pounds. By 1953, the Navy had loaded them up with enough gear. They weighed 80,000 pounds.
He says that twin propeller P-2s were hard to get off the ground. That's why the Navy added jet engines.
When you started the P-2, you didn't fire up the jet engines until you got to the end of the runway.
Dennis Cutterbank was a crew member in the mid-60s.
The crew member had to get back here out of that porthole on the port side and they'd say, standing by on the port engine, standing by on the port engine, and then they'd fire the engine up, and they would want to know if there was a flame or if it was catching on fire. And I'd say, yeah, it smoked a little bit, but it's a good start.
And I was in VP-10, and this was a VP-10 airplane, and I got about 100 hours in this airplane.
On this very plane?
Yes.
Red and Bill were both P-2 pilots and became close friends, each flying these planes often 12 hours at a time to hunt down Soviet subs.
Part of our search requirements was drop little noisemakers, make a bang, and equipment would register bounce off the sub. So the submariners knew we were overhead. So.
And what was the idea? Force them to come to the surface?
Not exactly. Well, there was a couple things. One is we would locate them and we would report it so the Navy could send a 100-killer sub, American one, to trail them, or a destroyer. Or we just drive them crazy by dropping these bangs on them.
The P-2s also served in Vietnam, often doing communications, we were told, but other combat missions too. In the mid-1960s, the larger four-engine P-3s began to take over. And in 1970, Bill Locke found this former Brunswick plane at a reserve base in New Orleans and flew it home for display.
To get it down here, we had to not only take the wings off, so it'll fit.
Yes, I worked on this aircraft. I was the one that stripped it of all of its electrical gear.
What a sight out there today. See so many friends, former shipmates. It's unbelievable.
The Brunswick Naval Air Museum raised $60,000 in donations to restore the plane. A monument to more than 100 Brunswick airmen lost on flight missions over those years, and to all those who did their duty and came home, their missions largely unknown by Americans then and even now. But a story these old sailors hope will be remembered. Now, they had hoped to be able to move that plane down farther into the old base and put it next to the P-3 aircraft that also sits outside the museum. But, Rob, they said it was going to cost way too much money, like $100,000 to take the wings off and move it down, so that plane's going to stay right where it is. And an interesting thing about the paint job, it's kind of like putting on a dress uniform. The veterans of that plane told me that back in the day, it didn't really look like that. They had it all painted with blue camouflage, so you wouldn't see it over the ocean.
Which makes, of course, perfect sense.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thanks, John.
Thanks.